I'm Beth Williston, and I am the chair of president of OAIA and co-chair of the conference planning committee. When I'm not volunteering at OAIA, I'm also the associate director of infrastructure planning and permitting at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. At TRCA, I'm responsible for directing teams of planners and technical staff in the review of impact and environmental assessment for a wide range of projects in the Greater Toronto Area, for highways, subways, pipelines, little things, big things. That would be my job. I'd like everybody to please take a moment with me to acknowledge that our conference is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that these lands are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants in this generation or in generations past. We declare our commitment to building meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the historic and continued impacts of colonization and the need to work toward meaningful reconciliation with the original caretakers of this land. We acknowledge that our conference lands are covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands, and that we have a responsibility to recognize the value, the rights, we have a responsibility to recognize and value the rights of Indigenous nations and peoples and conduct business in a manner that is built on the foundation of trust, respect, and collaboration. I would now like to invite Gary Pritchard of the Curve Lake First Nation to provide us with a traditional opening and welcoming remarks.
Okay, so Anin Bozo, everyone. Right? We're going to talk about protocols today, and when an Indigenous knowledge keeper, elder, or chief, or a delegate of that committee actually addresses you, it's actually polite as a Canadian and a settler to actually address them back, right? So that's what we're going to start learning and teaching you while I'm here today. We'd like to open it in a good way. I've actually smudged the room prior to everyone arriving. I don't typically smudge anybody, but if anybody would like to participate in a smudge, pull me aside and we can do that later. Also, please pay for parking. Parking is extremely weird here at U of T. I know this because I usually just park in the loading bay when I'm here teaching. But we'll open in a good way. These are words I've received from Chief Stacy LaForme. It ties a lot into impact assessments and what settlers do to our lands. So sooner or later, the damage sustained to our lands by colonial practices and colonial people will become irreversible. On that day, the settlers will not notice, for their lives will continue. But life will be, for our children, will forever change. They will face a world in chaos, a world where water is fought over, and a world that cannot support a population that will face a world that they did not create. A world inherited from you and from me. A world they did not deserve and a place they did not deserve. A place where the future is not promised. As Anishinaabe people, we are the sacred keepers of this land. She shelters us and sustains us. Long after the flesh falls from the spirits, we care for these lands. Our drums will be heard upon the winds. Our voices will rustle in the leaves. My people will have a sacred trust with this land and a trust that no man can break. A trust that death cannot sever. When we were here when you first appeared and when you first stepped onto this land, and we'll be here after you leave this land. And that's important to start taking away, right? I often talk about people, if you meet me in a consultation circle, I do apologize, but I'm not as cute and cuddly. But it is actually very much that you need to understand, as a Canadian, you wake up every morning, you have breakfast, you kiss your loved ones, you go to work. Your job entails actually breaking the Constitution of Canada, breaking the treaty and the inherent rights of the First Nations people. That's what you went to school to do, right? And so we need to break down those barriers and understand that. And we're going to talk about that later on today. But we need to start opening in a good way in every meeting, we need to do land acknowledgements. That's so important. We need to open in ceremony and prayer, which we've done. Also, exchange of tobacco is also necessary. Interesting about tobacco is our people never had any cancer-related diseases to tobacco in our bone tissues until Europeans came, made it a commodity, and that's what our teachings have told us. The Creator will actually harm us if we manipulate and create an economy out of sacred items. But we did that today, so hopefully that will carry on. Another big thing about First Nations people, we don't clap. We've actually asked the spirits that by smudging and invited them into this room. So at the end, if you feel like clapping, just sit on your hands because it's really awkward. I did something like this for the United Nations this year, and at the end they just stood instead of clapping and standing ovation. It was just standing. It was super awkward. Just don't do anything weird to me. But how do we walk together? We need to create ethical space, right? A place where both our knowledge systems are valid. We don't do that, right? We actually have a hierarchy of knowledge and education. And I even teach in this building and these buildings around here, so I do know about that hierarchy. We need to create that equal space and actually listen to what we're saying as Indigenous people. We've been here for 15,000 years. We have a great baseline data set. Stop and reflect. When you talk about what the work you do, have you ever put yourself second and the Indigenous people first? Have you looked at inherent rights of the Indigenous people, the treaty rights, and the Constitution? And that's where you need to start looking, because you can't have a policy without going through an act which stems from a treaty. And with that, I wish you all a good day, and we'll open the conference. All right, me again. Here we go. So, are impact and environmental assessments still harming Indigenous people? Short answer is yes, right? We already kind of went through that. So, it is actually interesting. We're going to take you through some examples. I am a Mississauga person. I come from the other side of the 404 highway, if you want to make that geographical reference. Thank God Ontario put the highway there. It's so much easier to talk about a treaty divide when there's a highway that streams through the territory. That's me. I do work at the Four Directions of Conservation. We were created because the nations got tired of all the consultants in the world screwing up Indigenous treaty and Aboriginal rights. So they approached me at Christmas. I thought it was family dinner, and I was wrong. They peer pressured me into starting my own company and said, what's the worst that could happen during a global pandemic? And I'm like, gosh, okay, sure, why not? Here we are, and we're now about 20 people, give or take, and with offices in Hiawatha and Barrie. We're also looking at a satellite office in Blueberry River First Nation. The idea of today is actually start you on a learning journey. Do I believe Ontarians and consultants know how to do Indigenous engagement well? Not really. As an Indigenous person, I really struggle with some of the ideas that people put forward when you try to describe my rights to myself and my communities. My favorite thing you do as non-Indigenous people is argue with me about where my territory is. That is my favorite thing that happens every week, and that's how we do. So the big take-home message is to connect with the community when you're done this and actually start formulate relationships, right, with First Nations. That's the big takeaway. You can't have a transactional relationship where it's just the exchange of money to do work together. You actually need to come and hang out with us and have a meaningful place. That's what the treaties were about. So why are we here? Everything settlers do is driven by the economy, right? So if you look at it from one lens, colonialism equals economic development equals climate change equals colonialism, and it's just this big spiral of me versus you, it seems sometimes. And that's the world that we live in. And that's the difference worldview between us and as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. When we talk about our communities prospering, being very wealthy, it's our community, right? Our community is healthy and well because it's our community, not, developer X is super rich and wealthy. Right? It's not an individual thing. It is us as Indigenous people collectively that are healthy. And that's the difference between our worldviews and our spirituality and you would even say religion or belief system. And that's one of the things that really miss the mark when we have these conversations, right? It is well documented that conservation and colonialism go hand in hand together, and you'll see a lot of these little great books that I'm also a professor and we reference quite throughout the whole presentation. But we know that Canadians don't understand our rights. They don't know how to ask the simple question. By the way, okay, Gary, what is your rights? Right? They're afraid to come to me. Didn't see it come in there. She spends a lot of time with me, so she knows what we're talking about. But it's funny because people don't have the grace to actually just come and say, hey, Gary, you want to grab a coffee? Can you tell me about what your rights are? And we can do that, right? We're happy to do that. If we're protecting our rights, we're protecting you as well. That's the interesting thing that people forget. When we exert our treaty rights, and our inherent rights for protection, I'm thinking about you, your family, your children, your grandchildren when we do this. And that's the thing that's always missed in this conversation, is us protecting each other. That we actually put conservation, well, we'll put air quotes on conservation because I don't believe settlers know how to do that either, but in our treaty because we saw the practices that Europeans were doing when they first got here. So we actually have these fundamental systems written in I'm going to blow everybody's mind in a minute here. The other part is economics, right? As we move through this new greener process of greener transportation, right? No gasoline. Has anybody thought about the Indigenous people? 90% of our economy comes from the selling of gas to you guys. Has anybody thought what's going to happen to us once you take that economy away from us? Right? That's a big peril. Once again, settlers have got to include their Indigenous partners in the treaty relationship to take us to the next level of green society, right? So that's something you need to talk about. But don't worry, we're very resilient people. We actually have a plan too. So we have been working with our partners in the nuclear industry and other industries to own battery storage facilities for the future. Nope, we don't want that video. Rethinking terms, right? The I word. People hate the I word, right? They don't like to use the term Indian. I'm still an Indian under the Indian Act. Do not forget that. My birth certificate says I'm an Indian. I'm cool with being called an Indian. My family is cool with being called that. Don't be afraid to call us that. I just re-signed my mortgage, which was super neat, on Monday. And it says, you know, Gary, under the Indian Act, you can only own one house. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, look at that. Right, so they still address me as an Indian. So you could actually theoretically call that us an Indian. You won't offend the people that you're working with, because that's what we're called. But you could use better terms. I don't like the term Indigenous because there is difference of the law, right? The term, it's Aboriginal law. It's not Indigenous law. So you need to start thinking the balance of that. But you could call me a Mississauga person, a Mississauga Anishinaabe person, a Anishinaabe person. The Cree are called the Muskegewak, and the Mohawk people are called the Haudenosaunee. Why don't you address this by our actual proper terms? Stop using terms like BIPOC with us. Because as Indigenous people, and First Nations especially, we hate the term BIPOC because we have legislation, Canadian legislation against us. Those other communities don't. And we need to actually acknowledge that space, that we have federal law against me on how much money I can make as a company owner, how I can leave my shares, right? I have to leave my shares to my kids. My kids are 9 and 6, right? I don't think they can run a multi-million-dollar company. Well, who knows, maybe they could. But we need to actually start doing that. People get upset with the term settler, right? And that was the thing. I actually got called out, which side of the building am I on? Over in that building there, I was teaching a course on Indigenous settler relations in the forestry industry, and the kids were actually getting mad that I was calling them settlers because they associate that with a past tense of thing. That's what my grandfather did. Or the one kid was really mad at me. He just moved here to do post-secondary education. I said, yes, but what are you doing today on the backs of my people? What are you taking from the backs of my people right now? He's like, I don't know. And I said, you need to start asking those questions as a person living on this in this land and in this space. Stop being so fragile as settlers, right? Oh my God. You can come to my house and have coffee with me and we can talk about whatever you want, whether it be Indigenous and fishing, nothing, just hang out with me. people are so afraid to come meet with us because they're so fragile. You know, if you actually, it's funny because I got this Crown reputation where I should be more friendly and I'm confrontational, but and I actually said that's trauma, which people don't realize. That's a type of trauma that I carry from all the racism that's put on me. And like, well, you need to open your circle more. And I'm like, well, people who are part of my circle are very loved and I take care of them. Why should I extend that to a group that could actually be causing me harm? But you can come over and actually have coffee, right? Our office in Hiawatha, we just got clean water a year ago. Feel free to come and have some clean water with us. If you want to take a shower, go for it, right? We're very excited to show this off to you. My own reserve, just outside of Peterborough near Trent University, it's been 42 years without water. When we get water there, come have a glass of water with us. Acknowledge that space. Stop using terms like we are still learning for racial tendencies that people say to us. If I made a racial slur to someone or a biased term, I can't say, I just learned about Canadians, right? That's really ignorant to say stuff like that, and that really affects us, and we take that home with us. We're often villainized for things that we say that's the truth, right? We're in a truth mission right now. We're nowhere near reconciliation. In fact, we actually have shirts at work that says #Villindians because I'm always villainized, and it's done in royal purple. It's kind of fun. So if you see me making fun of you like that, it's actually to teach you to be more holistic and have some love. We use the term colonization, right? It's the creating of established control over the Indigenous people. Colonialism is actually what settlers are doing now through policy. You create policies to actually limit Indigenous rights. That's a big one, right? So how did the acts that we work in or the policies limit Indigenous participation? Parentalism, that's a big thing of racism we get all the time. You know, it's highly connected to colonialism. A lot of organizations, no offense if you work for them or you're here, but a lot of the province organizations have a degree of parentalism over us. They say they have no funding, right? Even though it's their job to act honorably and actually fund duty consult, they actually make proponents pay for it. A big, thing of colonialism is the Indian Act. And we need to actually start shifting that paradigm to actually working together in collaboration. That is what the treaty actually says, so we need to work that way. People deny our rights. We've had many governmental people say that we don't have rights because it impacts their development, and we need to actually have an understanding what our rights are. That starts with an open heart, open conversation with us. What are your rights, right? That's really interesting. And so we have 3 types of rights for Indigenous people. We have our inherent rights, our Aboriginal rights, and our treaty rights. The treaty rights are really cut and dry. They're pretty simple. We actually have them written down in a treaty. The thing that settlers forget is that they were not given to us by the Crown. We told them what we wanted. So you're going to see some of those rights come up. Inherent and Aboriginal rights are a little more complicated. This is where policymakers get really confused and bogged down. There's about 700 different First Nations in this country. And there's 700 different types of Indigenous rights throughout the country. And that's where these blanket policies that are created don't work and serve Indigenous people. Because you can have a policy, but you're going to need 700 companion manuals to go along with that policy, right? For me, you need to have a policy on how to work in the Williams Treaty First Nations settlement area, right? You need that to make this work. It is different than if you go to the Robinson-Huron Treaty. We do not align, and that's the big thing. Perspectives, and I actually try to rush through this so that we have more time for questions, because I can feel the questions coming. Indigenous nations understood that these were agreements of working together. A lot of people talk about the peace and friendship treaties that they signed in the East. They were all meant to be peace and friendship treaties. I don't understand why they're only in one spot and the other. The Crown views that we surrendered our land. And if we surrendered our land so much, why do we always win in court then, if we talk about it from that perspective? Our rights to water. Here's a big thing. How many people work with water in their everyday career or something? Oh, that's not bad, half of you. You have no rights to have a job in Canada. We never gave you permission as Indigenous nations across this country to work with water. It's ironic because I come from a community that doesn't have clean water, right? There's no legal basis. All the treaties signed with your people were on farming. They were never meant for you to use or disrupt water. So floodplain management, any of that is an impact to the treaty rights that were signed by the First Nations. You cannot avoid that. And that is something that engineers and practitioners struggle with. They don't know, like once we say, hey, you can't avoid this, we need to work together and have that conversation. But here's all our different acts. If you ever want to get these acts, please let me know. I can send them to you. We have them on our website to download. But here's the 4 different policy acts that we use to refer to our policy around water. Hierarchy of rights. We often talk about people how, oh, that's what the policy says, therefore we can't do anything. How are we for time? Are we still good for time? You're good. Awesome. All these people moving around freaking me out. Because I can spend hours on this, just so you know. People often say, well, that's a part of the bylaw system. We can't touch that. Well, you don't get a bylaw without the aid from the province, which is aid from the federal government, which is aided from the act, aid from the treaty. See how that actually hierarchies all through. So you actually still need to talk to us about the hierarchy of rights. Environmental assessment versus duty to consult. This is a really sticking point for us. We as Indigenous people, we tend to feel like we're in the same meeting every day with a different proponent, one to the next and to the next. And it's really interesting. I'm going to show you the 2018 Williams Tree settlement. And how many people know that we have a new settlement agreement in Southern Ontario that basically occupies a third of it? That gives you new rules and grants you permissions or denial under treaty. Besides Lisa, because she sits with me all the time. Anyone? No, see, no one does. So we're going to talk about that. And this is where the Crown has failed to educate all of you as practitioners on what to be doing. The only Crown entity that did it right was Ontario Parks, and they had it on their website for 42 hours. Right? We're like, good job, Ontario Parks. But we'll talk about that. Another big thing is understanding a litmus test, right? We're all scientists. I am a scientist as well, not just an Indigenous person. A great fundamental thing to be looking at is the Sparrow test. It's actually, you can Google it, just type in the internet, Google the Sparrow test. It actually talks about you, and that's how Bill 23 was not going to work for First Nations, because that denied our rights, and we actually sent several legal letters to that extent that you can't deny rights of First Nations for building homes. Ironically, that was in the court case, and it just happened to come back in Ontario. Fantastic. But this is what we actually do. So my team and I do a rights impact assessment. We can totally do a webinar on that if you guys want. And then we come back to our lawyers and say, okay, here's what we found. Here's how we move forward. And I'll give you an example of that too. So here we are, the Mississauga and Anishinaabe people. We are the people of the big river mouths. We occupied and defended the north shore of Lake Ontario. Our territory, basically, this is our territory. This isn't our traditional territory. This is our active territory. That's the big thing. People use the word traditional. It's because that is a colonial term to say we're no longer active in that territory, but we are currently active here. That's our territory. We signed 18 of the 42 treaties in the province of Ontario. We have a ton of treaties to go through, so much so we are still currently researching them to figure out what they mean, where they all are. Very complicated is treaty research. I love the archive system in Ontario. It's like the data when I worked at the M&R, not really organized, and we have to kind of fish through it to see what works. But this is the interesting thing. This is a little purple square. I don't know if you guys can see it. It goes all the way up to Lake Simcoe, all the way over to Belleville, down through Vaughan, cuts over at the 404 highway. It's called the Gunshot Treaty, or the Johnson-Butler Purchase of 1788. Apparently in 1788, the Crown fired a gun, and this is the area that it covered. Understand we still had trees and we had all that stuff, and who knows what kind of gun it was. Really interesting about this. But we actually put environmental parameters in that treaty. We actually said that settlers can never live on an island, never occupy a shoreline. They have to live 66 feet from either side of a water course is designated First Nation land. Anybody know why it's 66 feet? It's a road allowance, right? That's something that people knew. It's also a chain in forestry. So that if those old people that are like I am that used chains before we had like GPS, that's what we used to do. That was a measurable distance that they had. You can never destroy a beaver house or a beaver dam. That was written in the treaty. And that was written, does anybody know why that was written in the treaty? Come on, this is an easy question. Lisa, why was it written in the treaty? Come on, we just did an event. You weren't there, I know, but everybody thinks it's for fur harvesting, right? Because everybody thought that was what was driving the economy was for fur harvesting. It was actually to protect Atlantic salmon habitat. We knew in 1788 the correlation between beaver houses, beaver dams, and Atlantic salmon. Western science finally caught up on my birthday on May 18th, 1998, which was super weird, because that was the year I decided to do this career. That's how long it takes for Western science to catch up to our knowledge. So we actually have these provisions that are written in the treaty that no one has ever looked at and are violating every day, right? So if you're a floodplain mapper, you're impacting the Constitution of Canada, right? I don't want you to go home and feel really bad when we start talking about this, but understand that that's what you're doing. You can't cut down a maple tree in basically Vaughan to Belleville to Lake Simcoe. Those are protected. Same with oak trees. Those are protected under my treaty rights. Just think about what's happened now, right? And all the impacts that have happened. There's a whole bunch of us. If you work in Southern Ontario, for the most part, you only have 7 nations to negotiate with. It's actually quite fun. They are Alderville, Beausoleil, Chippewas, Arama, Chippewas, Georgina Island, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Mississauga, Scugog. We have, over the last few years, have come together with environmental scientists as well as our lawyers, who are all Indigenous people, to actually create a network of companies to help provide people with these answers to these questions. That's the interesting thing. We don't rely on non-Indigenous people to facilitate these conversations, right? And our new settlement happened in 2018, right? Not that long ago. None of you probably have heard of this, right? We had a brand new settlement, an apology from Canada and Ontario for them to do better, right? For all of you living and occupying my territory to do better. And I feel bad for you because I come into the table and I say, hey, under our 2018 settlement and our apology, what are you doing to be better to me? And everybody usually asks me, like, what are you talking about, Gary? You have no idea what you're talking about, right? We had a pledge from all of your leadership to my leadership to be better. It cost $1 billion that you're paying off as the taxpayers of Ontario. We are also allocated lands as part of that compensation. The lands have never come forth from Canada or Ontario. And we need to actually still working to be better. That's our new territory. Interesting thing about First Nation territory, anybody go on the Aboriginal Treaty Information Rights Network thing, ATRIS? Do you know how flawed that is? Super funny. And the guy who designed ATRIS did not like curvatured lines. He must have been an engineer. And he actually straightened all the lines to actually falsify treaty boundaries. So that's actually proven. So now the treaty boundaries are actually all not very accurate. So this is our newest treaty. So this is the treaty map that you should go by. Unfortunately, the Crown won't share this with you. You can't take a picture of it. No, I see it right there. That's okay. I'm a dad. I got eyes like a hawk. But if you can come, you want to come and see this map, we can show you a copy. But I just can't give it to you. And I love the Crown on this one. They made the GIS layer. Every treaty boundary is a nice 1.5 kilometers thick, right? Very fun when you're driving around a map trying to figure out where you are in the car, which treaty are we in, right? Fantastic. But that is our new settlement. I'm hoping that one day you can go online and actually see this as one colored polygon, because that's the rights within that area. So you know a little bit about our salmon, right? We talk about, this is the first fish in Ontario's history to actually measure impact. So I think it's important to talk about this. We were never brought to the table about restoring the Atlantic salmon either. We have this whole knowledge system about how to manage them. They went all the way up to Bancroft, Ontario. The Atlantic salmon from Lake Ontario swam all the way up to Bancroft. It's amazing to think about that. We need to start looking at how to restore that fish together. That restores our cultural identity, right? This is the first fish that Europeans permitted away and created impact. They took my culture away from me that is now extinct. I'll never have that fish back in my life. So it is not about species at risk, the conversation about species at risk. It is actually cultural survival. We don't care about bobolinks, chimney swifts, things that showed up with Europeans, right? They showed up with them. I care about the red-winged blackbird, who's at 50% of its population, even though it's 2 million. That's an indicator, and we have oral histories around, that's the first bird of spring, because we know that when that bird shows up to nest, we can get our canoes out into the wetlands and start harvesting again. Shifting the baseline syndrome. Settlers have a horrible memory. Your memory can somehow only expands the length of your career. It's about 20 years, right? Our history goes for very long. We actually have, if you look at Indigenous art, you look at Indigenous teachings, we're doing something really cool this weekend. We're getting together at Lang Pioneer Village in Peterborough, telling Indian ghost stories, right? What could go wrong there? That's what we're doing with all the kids, right? And that's gonna be a lot of fun. But it's to keep those memories alive, right? A good example of, does anybody know what mammal went extinct in the port of Oshawa in 1882? Anyone? Oh, this is rough, eh? The harbor seal. We had seals in Lake Ontario. Killed by Europeans, right? Didn't want them. Does anybody know what European buckthorn was originally used for? Sorry, I can't hear you. That's what everybody thinks. It was actually used, it's one of the fundamentals of black powder. And my great-grandfather used to tell stories about how they'd watch the European farmers make black powder with European buckthorn and then shoot at us. So that's how that story was passed on, right? We learned to actually use some of our trapping equipment with it. Understand our connection to nature. We are all a part of nature. We cannot avoid that, right? We need to actually make sure that we are encompassing us in nature. And that's one of the things that, people don't realize, right? They either destroy it all, build Toronto, or they create places like Algonquin Park that has restrictions and you can't occupy that space. There is a balance and we need to work within that. Western mitigation, you can't mitigate impacts to our rights without conversation with us. And that's the big take-home message. I can't stress that enough. It might work out for you from a Western construct, but just impacts to rights are still there. And I'll show you what we do. So here's a very simple, everybody talks about the pathways of effect, right? Fantastic pathways of effect. We have now gone through this whole analytical tool. Simple activity, you're gonna be trenching, right? Very simple activity, everybody does that, ditching or removal of vegetation. The pressure, soil and erosion remediation. Effect, change in water quality, result, death of fish, right? Interesting piece though, no one has actually looked at the treaty rights. Our people, because we were restricted by misinterpretation of treaty that we got the apology for, use drainage ditches to collect all our traditional medicines in. That's the interesting piece. People come to me and say, hey Gary, what did you guys use this forest for? Well, I have to go and talk to certain elders that are still alive because we haven't been there for 100 years because settlers kicked us out and arrested us to do that. But that drainage ditch over there, I know as a kid, we used to go spear frogs, we used to do all these things in there. That drainage ditch needs to be protected. You will call it the municipal right of way, and it's okay just to destroy or relocate or move or do, and ironically, that is more important to us culturally at the moment than that forest stand. We need to have those conversations, right? It's really interesting now that I've said that, right? Because that's one of the things that people always fail at. Accommodations. Why did I leave this slide blank? Don't be shy. Don't make me ask other people I know. Okay, Beth, you can go. Well, there is, but you need to have a conversation with us to figure out what accommodations are. That's the interesting piece, right? We have people now, these Indigenous relation experts who are not Indigenous, no offense if you are one of those people. We find it really interesting because you come to us with our accommodations already laid out. Really interesting from that perspective because that does not meet a meaningful engagement space, right? That is really interesting for me because I'm like, well, we've mathematically calculated the density of those trees based on, the Western knowledge system. It's going to, you're damaging this dollar amount. We'd like to take that dollar amount and buy land to protect it as Indigenous people. That's what we want as an accommodation. But we never got asked that question again. We need to be asking questions, creating meaningful space. So always come with a blank slate what the accommodation looks like, right? Because we need to have that conversation. And now what we do, and this is something I'm going to do with all of you, we do this with our young people, with our elders, and I'm now what the hell am I called now? A guardian? Not a guardian, a guide. I'm no longer a warrior. I just got named this the other day, so I'm still learning what to call myself. I can put my bow down and not be a warrior, but then if I have to pick it up and lay a beat down, I can still do that. But I always open it up to questions, right? This is what I do with my kids too at the end of the week. We have a fire outside, and we have what are some of the burning questions you have now to move forward in a good way? Lisa, don't make me pick on you, but you fire one at me.
Thanks, Gary. There is a microphone in the back, so if you raise your hands, one of our colleagues will bring that to you. Raise your hand, singular, and you can ask your questions. Start a conversation. Beth.
It might be like a Zoom thing or whatever we're doing.
I probably need it because of, again, our virtual participants. So my question to you, Gary, is you said we can call you Indian. It's not sensitive, but we can say that word. You prefer not to be called Indigenous because it's not inclusive of, it's not so direct.
Well, it gives
I guess.
too much inclusivity.
Too
That's
much
the problem.
inclusivity. Yeah. But what if we don't know? What if it's, we're writing something or we're communicating something and I just don't know.
So I go by Gary usually.
Hi, Gary.
But that's one of the things, right? Like I always find it funny. A great example of communication. So I always find it funny that like we have protocols on our websites in the community. We have downloadable protocols. We have videos. We have made every way possible that you can find this information.
Sorry.
But we are a community. We're not a reserve. We're just a community, right? You can use that term. You can use the term First Nation because it is actually in our title. You can use the term Indigenous, and in the meeting, when you get a meeting with us, how would you like to be referred to?
Right.
Once again, simple question, right? Simple question. Because I remember when I first started working out West, and this is, living, and I worked for the Union of Ontario Indians, now the Anishinaabe Nation, just because we changed that to be more politically correct. And I remember, like, the First Nation said, Gary, we'd like to be referred to as a tribe and a bunch of Indians. All right, I wrote that down. I'm like, wow. And in my mind, I was like, wow, I would never do that. Think to do that. And so we need to actually have that humility, have that, how would you like to be referred to in the report? Very simple. The other thing I do find weird though, is that all of you send the letters to the chief. And you expect as a Canadian, of low rank, of just a Canadian, to get a response back, right? Does Trudeau text you, email you, call you? No. Right? That's the same weight that you need to give those spaces. That's why I always find it funny. And we have it now in 18 font on our website. It goes to consultations at Curve Lake, consultation at Hiawatha. And it's funny though, because dear chief, and our chief is 87, right? He's got a lot on the go. He's also mentoring all of us to be the next generation of leaders. Do you get the same response from the government when you email them? Probably not, right? Junior Planner X is requesting and demanding a meeting of the chief. I'm like, okay, right? Good. I said, and then I actually wrote back, because if I get the email, I'm like, can you please bring Trudeau, right? Or would you like me to call him? Because I can, right? And then it's just because I kind of make fun of you a bit, but it's like that hard lesson. So I do with my kids too. I'm not a good father, but I pick at them a bit because you need to have that lesson, right? You need to have humility. And have a little fun with it, right? I actually reviewed a letter the other day, and I wrote in the comments WTF, and then I wrote nope, right? And they're like, oh, well, at least that was an honest answer from you. And I said, yeah, it is. Anyone else? Don't be shy. I'm only here for today.
We have one in the back.
I know apparently I'm a part of a panel that I didn't know about.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just thinking of shifting baselines and just wondering, what do you think a baseline is that works for Indigenous people? And is there a way to create this kind of repository to have that baseline conversation?
That's an interesting, and we're working on that as a nation. That is a really interesting question. Luckily, we have these like county, municipal databases of GIS photos. So we tend to go back, and we're doing this right now through a cumulative effects analysis for the Williams Treaty, because we're like, hey, thanks for giving us back the gunshot treaty, but there's only 10% land available to First Nations, so it really didn't make a difference. So we're actually really working on what that looks like. So we're doing a remediation right now in Port Hope with all the contaminants. We were able to go back to 1923 with the air photos. I don't know what you guys were all air photoing back in 1923, but thank you. And so we're like, okay, well that's probably when there's least environmental impact then, right? And so let's go back to then, right? Because if you look at this creek, it actually was a wetland. It actually had protection. And so that's what we go to. We're working on, that's a great conversation to have with nations though, because it's like, what does it look like?
And over to the other side of the room. You're getting your exercise
That's
this
right, you'll get your
morning
steps in today, don't you worry.
Thank you very much again for sharing your knowledge. I was curious about situations where you have proponents or what have you, settlers talking to you, where there are overlapping treaties, treaty rights, and traditional rights, and where there's an identified conflict. So for example, I work in the Grand River watershed, traditional territory of Mississauga, but also treaty rights of Mohawk there.
Are they treated?
That's a good question.
They have a lease with Canada, a treaty.
Right. But so I guess that sets up a potential conflict between three different nations. And I was wondering, like, what is the approach when that comes up and you're kind of put in that spot? Is that something like, I think as settlers, we would typically go, ooh, let's take this offline and talk by ourselves. Is that
Right, and that's
something
the biggest
that
mistake
you would do as well?
No, that's the biggest mistake settlers do, because you guys don't come back with anything, right? I see that so many times at different levels of government. It's like, we'll take this offline, or we'll take that back with us. Where's this back that you guys never come back from? It's like Bed Bath and Beyond. You're in the beyond, and it's hilarious, right? And yeah, they're gone now. I used to love that store, but it's been hours there. But it's funny because you never come back with anything. So as soon as they say we're going to take that back, we're like, well, we're never going to hear for that again, right? And the Supreme Court of Canada has actually said that nations with conflict between each other have to work it out themselves before you can move forward on your project. So that's what the law says. You also have to look at the spectrum of engagement. So rights holders trump interest holders. They have a lease for a very specific parcel of land. They can't extend that out, right? They just can't make up land, right? Where you have a territory, they have a lease for this very specific parcel. But most nations, over time, we work great together, right? Like we meet Curve Lake, Scugog, and Hiawatha. We meet 3 times a week about same projects that you're all talking about. We come up with consensus to do that. Allow us that space to make that consensus decision, right? Because we have very uneducated Crown officials that don't know anything about treaty law, treaty rights, inherent rights. They don't. They have these titles, but they actually don't know what to do. So you need to allow the rights holders to actually work together to formulate a solution. And that's the big thing, right? The interesting thing, like I look at the land acknowledgement for today, I would not argue today's land acknowledgement's incorrect, right? And because of these spaces, what you guys have done by not being open and honest, the Inuit now are launching a land claim for Toronto because of the actions of your people, right? So we need to actually understand what's happening by what you're doing is causing on the landscape too. So we need to actually have those conversations and be a part of those conversations. Come and learn something, right? So that you don't make the same mistakes again. And then take that information. This is one of the cool things we used to do with the fire, is that I'd break the fire up at the end, make sure the fire is extinguished before you do this. God, I cannot stress that enough. And we'd hand a piece of fire to you to take home to light a fire again, so you could share with people what you learned, right? The other interesting thing that settler organizations do is they send one person, always. You need to have a mentoring system. Remember in the day, like when I was a government employee, we used to actually have a tiered mentoring system, and I do that at my office. That way, if I get sick, Beth can go in my place, but Beth and I are usually traveling together, right? That way, we have that continuity. I don't get a chance to anybody from the Crown because they'd last there like 3 days, right? Like, we got new people in the Crown again. Okay, now we have to educate them all again about this. You know, I call it circling the drain, is what I do in my everyday life. I'm like, okay, so now I need to teach you Indians 101, you know, Mississauga people. That's what's happening, right? The transfer of knowledge is not being passed on. Settlers work in silos, and we need to start breaking down silos, and that's a big part of that's what's failing the environment, is this siloed approach. I think we're good, aren't we?
We got time, so.
Do we?
yeah.
Fantastic. There you go, Sil. Where are you? I told you I wouldn't talk that long, because she bet me that
I have it
for
that
days.
we end at 10:15, and
Ooh,
it says 9:45 to 10:15. I've
Oh, we
been
can
watching
go
that.
whenever you like.
Session 1A.
Sure.
Is
My
that
question.
correct?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No,
go
no,
ahead. No, go ahead.
please, yeah.
No, that's great. So
Ask away.
Yeah. So my question is related to your last comment about settlers have to allow your communities to work things out amongst themselves. We have a lot of situations in the role that I'm in and my team where we are on, based on our funding partners, they want us to get projects done, within a, 3-year time frame, 2-year time frame, whatever that is that they say. I just want to find out from, your perspective, is that offensive if we ask or if we're nudging and asking to potentially even go as far as potentially facilitating a discussion? I mean, I'll tell you, I'll give you an example. I have a lot of treaty situations where it's MFCN, but I also have historical affiliations with the Huron-Wendat that I work with, and we have a good rapport, and sometimes there are those interactions, but sometimes there are not, and I'm just curious about your perspective as if it's too nudgy or if it's disrespectful for us to ask to facilitate a discussion or conversation.
it is actually, because it's still a part of us affiliating to be the same as you, right? There's a whole assimilation to your timeline, assimilation. We have been nothing but assimilating to your people and accommodating to your people. There's never been us put forward. This is interesting, you bring up the Huron-Wendat. Do you know that there's a protocol for them to how to act in Mississauga territory? No, there's my everybody's face. Yeah, there's a protocol on how the Huron-Wendat are to behave in our territory now, right? So these are things that you need the nation to actually dispel to you in these moments. There's rules that we've created as nation to nation that need to come out, right? Huron-Wendat do not have environmental rights to this territory. They cannot legally be commenting on anything environmental. Dun, dun, dun. Right? Same, and so I'm not accusing anybody of anything. So, but those are things that you need to have that relationship with us to tell you on how you should be engaging, right? And by the way, here's the oral history of this site, right? Like the oral history, I'll give a great example. I did this one the other day. Did you know you would call it permaculture under your knowledge system, but the Oak Ridges Moraine, as well as there was a stand that went from Balsam Lake all the way down to Scarborough to point the way to Niagara Falls, was all oak and maple trees. Those were manicured landscapes by First Nations. This glacier theory that everybody has that made the Oak Ridges Moraine is not true. We actually actively use that. We have that artwork dating back to 1880, as well as our oral histories. And that's why they're protected within that treaty, because they were used by us. Allow that space to come forward and actually be told. And that's the hard part, right? And it's funny because we had a great engagement session the other day with Enbridge, and half of it was just all us talking around a fire. And it was actually one of the funnest days I've had in a long time. We went to the petroglyphs, we took them to do ceremony with us. We did some cultural teachings, we had lunch. Ironically, we went for Chinese food in Curve Lake because we don't have any restaurants and we don't have clean water, so we have to go off reserve. We did that that one day too, didn't we? And that's what we do. But we were sitting around having a fire and talking about, and it was just to formulate that relationship with those proponents. And we actually talked about, like, hey, by the way, do you know who had the first road, like when we got the road? Who got the first car 3 years after the road was built? Who got the first TV? But it was all important to get that, to share that knowledge and just talk about it as people, right? And we actually invited Scugog and we invited, Alderville with us, and it was just us hanging out with that proponent. That actually meant a lot. So now when we get to the conversation, those hard questions, we're able to talk more freely. And that's important, right? But if you push for your timeline, your project's not going to go well, right? We need that time and space. We also have a governance process, right? That's the interesting thing. We had a guy come to our table the other day. He's like, I need another consultant, right? Consultants are 90% likely to screw your project up. We're here to get consent. And there's like 6 nations around the table, and I just started laughing. And I'm like, oh, I didn't realize we were the chief and council, everyone. And so we don't do that. We take the information back to the beyond and talk about it to the community. And they were shocked, these consultants were shocked that we do that. We have these governmental processes, and like, and the guy actually said, he was a young engineer, let me get this straight, Gary, you have your own governance? I'm like, yeah, we've only had it for about 15,000 years. Seems to be useless in the eyes of you guys. And so it was kind of like a backhand slap, but I laughed because I was like, you didn't think we had a process. We have a governance process as well. It comes back, it goes to our committees, which is awkward for me because I'm on the team that represent the nation, but I'm also on committee. We don't have conflict of interest the same way you guys do. We don't have the population to have that. And so we vote on it and move forward. But it was so weird to be in the situation where we had our own process. And I'm like, well, that one's close to Scugog. We should probably talk to Scugog about that. And so we set up this whole framework of engagement. But the consultant's like, well, we don't like your framework of engagement. We're going to actually do our own. And we're like, oh, okay, well, whatever. That's going to really slow you down, but all right. And we're still going to do our traditional governance. You need to learn what traditional governance means, right? Because we didn't have biodiversity loss. We didn't have flooding. We didn't have climate change, right? I have a lime tree in my backyard that's flourishing right now. I can't, and so I know we have problems. We need to work on those problems. But if you push for funding, and also the other thing is, once you've entered in the realm of engagement, once we said as a nation, hey, by the way, yes, Project X we want to be engaged on, your timeline's gone. Doesn't matter. You've legally entered in engagement. So that's, you have to tell your funder that this is going to take a lot longer, or the government that, this is going to take a lot longer. And that's how it works. That's that reciprocal dialogue.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I can, there's one at the front. Do you want to use this?
I'll say hi, Lindsay.
2 at the front.
See you there.
Hi. I want to ask a potentially sticky subject of, you mentioned it earlier where proponents, we don't have the money for this. And us as practitioners, you want to do this, but we don't have the money for it. We don't have the budget for it. How do you reconcile that with wanting to do good engagement and not, yeah.
Yeah, I don't usually say that's your problem, because we'll say, because here's the issue, right? My company was established on consultants not doing a good job, so it's awkward. So we actually peer review. We come in and there's 2 groups, us and the 3 Fires group, that will collaborate and peer review the stuff you put forward. When the government loosely delegates the duty to consult to someone, and I'll say loosely because they'll never officially do it to you. This is the interesting piece. They will say, okay, it's going to cost you X number of dollars for us to peer review this. What proponents now are learning, certain, one special that we work with a lot, is that they retain the nation and the firms that work for them to do certain components to help elevate that. We also ask, this is really interesting now too, because everybody will say they do a great job at working with First Nations. Everybody does a great job. It's fantastic. Everybody's awesome. We ask to see your PAR certification. You guys know what PAR certification is? It's part of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business that you are a trusted business to actually work with Indigenous nations. It breaks down that racial barrier. It saves me doing anti-racism training with you. It saves me a lot more time. Because like right now, we just did our workload forecast for the new year. I was shocked. I actually thought we had really nothing on the go. I should have known better. We already have $1.8 million for the projects to review for first quarter of next year. That's the volume of projects that are happening in the territory that cause impact. So, that's part of it. Funding is part of this, and to ignore that and it goes blank, I go and tell the ministries, hey, they didn't consult meaningfully. So we're going to delay that project, right? And we've shut down major projects by delays like that. It's a tough road, right? Proponents don't want to pay, right? That's just how it is. But the industry's changing. I have a handful of industries that actually have great relationships with us. And those are the same people, when they're driving by my house, they know they can pop in, grab coffee, sit with us, sit with my family, do whatever, right? They've learned that they have a meaningful space in my home. So it takes time to build a good relationship. It takes one moment, though, to kill it, though, right? And that's the thing that people don't understand.
We have one last question. It's been suggested we segue to coffee after that.
That's right. The world's smallest cups here.
Thank you much for that presentation. I'm just wondering from your experience, so Ontario has a hard time considering cumulative effects when they do environmental assessments, and of course, rights impact analysis. I'm wondering if you have any examples of instances where communities have pushed back against that and are making inroads for the consideration of cumulative effects.
I will see you this time next year. So we actually have, right now, we're initiating a cumulative effects study for OPG, but we're doing it as OPG collectively as a company, not just nuclear. This is also where your studies get bogged down. Western science and Western practitioners finger one thing, not collectively everything. This is why, and your data's crap, right? Like if you really look at the historical data records, I don't know what you guys were keeping. But, and it's funny because if you look at a lot of our oral histories are collected in artwork, and I have a big art collection, so we actually know, and I keep a journal, and my staff actually write stuff down as we're driving in our tablets to create an oral history, but we're actually looking at, say, collectively, what is the impact of OPG? Because then that will talk about the legacy issues. We're also talking about legacy contaminants as well without the duty consult. There's a lot of those conversations. So maybe next year I'll come back and I'll say, this is what we did in year one. We're planning a 10-year venture with them, and it's going to be really exciting because we don't know. Maybe like the nuclear plant isn't the bad guy, but maybe this hydro dam over here is, right? And we need to work on refurbishing that to make the system work better, right? Or, hey, by the way, we know we're getting a lot of lake sturgeon now in the Kawarthas. They're starting to migrate up all through. We have northern pike now in Rice Lake. We need to create a management tool for that. So we're looking at that, right? We have this, like eels are starting to show up again. So we're starting to see things on the land as practitioners of our rights that need to be communicated that's being missed in those Western science studies, right? So we need to have more of those conversations. So next year I will have hopefully something for you.
Thanks very much, Gary.
It's my pleasure to welcome the presenters for our next session, which is titled The Changing Landscape of Meaningful Indigenous Engagement. So a great act to follow a great opening act. The presenters today are Jeremiah Perig and Sandy Nairn. Janine Rolfe unfortunately can't join us today. And I think you can take a moment to have a look at the biographies in the program, which will tell you a little bit about our presenters and who they work for and what their experience is. So I will not review that, let you do that on your own study time and give them more time to present and to tell us about their experiences and their work in this field. So without any more delays, I'll turn it over to our colleagues.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sandy Nairn, and my colleague Jeremiah Parag are excited to discuss the changing landscape of meaningful Indigenous engagement. I will say, Gary will have a hard act to follow your presentation, so bear with us. Clearly, Indigenous engagement in the context of impact assessments or projects has evolved, and of course, it still has a long way to go. It goes without saying that successful projects today require meaningful Indigenous engagement. We would like to humbly share some of our experiences in this regard and hopefully make some suggestions that will move the needle towards better Indigenous engagement processes and outcomes. So we'll start off with the agenda. So just a really short, brief introduction, and then sort of we'll go through the main parts of the presentation. So we're going to be talking a bit about sort of what we've heard and how we've responded to some of those types of concerns when engaging Indigenous communities. Now, when I say Indigenous communities, this draws on project experience both from First Nations and Métis, so bear with me if I use that combined term, Indigenous communities. We'll talk a bit about some of the lessons learned and key strategies that we've utilized, and we'll talk a bit about, at the end, about long-term relationship building. So we'll start off just a quick intro. As Kevin said, our bios are in the program. Jeremiah Parag is the consultation and engagement lead and equity engagement lead for the transportation group. We're all, the two of us are from HDR, employee-owned engineering, environmental, and architecture company. I will note that we are PAR committed. We still have a ways to go, but we have initiated that process. And I'm the Environmental Sciences and Planning Director for HDR Canada. Unfortunately, as Kevin said, Janine wasn't able to make it today with us due to health issues, so we'll do our best to cover. I'll do my best to cover her section. So maybe we'll without further ado, we'll get started in terms of the main presentation. And then I guess just up front, a disclaimer. I really wanted to note that these lessons learned are based on project learnings based on our experience over the past number of years. However, it's really important to note that it's not intended to generalize the overall opinions, of course, of Indigenous communities in relation to projects. So I think it's just important that we don't want to generalize. So I guess just to start it off, so sort of what we're hearing through the projects that we're actively involved in and how we've responded. I'm going to sort of share what we've been hearing and how we've responded. Both, I think it's important to note, this is both within the context of an EA or impact assessment, and also pre and post. So I think it's important, you know, when conducting Indigenous engagement, it shouldn't only be within the context of an EA or project. It should come before and follow through after in terms of implementation and potentially construction if it's a project. And as I noted earlier, it really does represent our collective experience and may differ from others that have joined us today, both in person and virtually. However, the intent here is really to initiate discussion and offer some alternative perspectives. I'll also add that this is our perspective as consultants, typically but not always working on behalf of a project proponent. So though we strive to be unbiased and objective, you know, everyone perceives things differently. So this is really just to say there's always room for better understanding and improvement. So first and foremost, Indigenous engagement is not a checkbox. The standards for Indigenous engagement were much lower in the past, and I think things are moving in the right direction, but there's still a long way to go. Indigenous engagement is an ever-changing space, and project managers need to be agile and open-minded when adapting to these new and evolving requirements. Corners are being cut and engagement feels hollow. This is one of the things we've heard. The process feels ingenuine and the consultation is more like a formality instead of a real opportunity for input. Meeting times are too short. The right people are not present at meetings, whether that be technical experts or decision makers. And it results really in a lot of unprepared project teams not providing relevant information. Suggested responses, clearly meeting lengths in many cases need to be sufficiently long in order to discuss key issues without being rushed. Perhaps at least an hour, I'm just throwing that out there. Really, this should be discussed in advance with the Indigenous communities you're meeting with to make sure there's sufficient time to discuss whatever is on the agenda. You should be anticipating questions and ensure the right people are present in attendance to be able to answer those questions. As I said earlier, decision makers should be present at those meetings, and ideally be prepared to make commitments during or soon after those meetings. No, we're going to take this back. Really, the Crown or the proponent must be open and honest and transparent, which means proactive information sharing on items related to the project. And also understand and appreciate that nation-to-nation communications are typically preferred. So we don't, as consultants, don't go there by ourselves to engage with Indigenous communities. Lack of transparent decision-making. As I think most people know, transparency is paramount in any kind of impact assessment, and especially when engaging Indigenous communities. You know, some pain points noted here: minimal touch points between Indigenous communities, consulting teams, and project proponents. Indigenous communities are often not made aware of project decisions until completion of the EA or the project, which is really quite unacceptable. More clarity needs to be given why or why not recommendations from Indigenous communities have been implemented. Too many comment noted type responses when receiving Indigenous feedback. And in terms of how we've responded, I guess one important thing is thorough note-taking is key during meetings to avoid misconstruing input. And part and parcel of that is that those notes need to be followed up with content verification by the Indigenous communities to basically acknowledge what was recorded was in fact correct or accurate, and if it's not, change it. Provide exact feedback on whether a comment has in fact been incorporated into the decision-making process or deliverable, and follow a what we heard, what we said, and what we did model to engagement. Explain how feedback was or was not implemented and provide rationale and explanations. And if feedback was implemented, explain that thoroughly. Okay, we're calling this one miscategorization during the engagement process. Indigenous communities are often treated the same as typical stakeholders or members of the public. Separate streams of consultation or engagement are typically not offered to Indigenous communities. And some suggested ways to address that: understand Indigenous communities are rights holders. Indigenous communities are not served by simply including them in the broader public meetings. That's not typically acceptable. And always provide separate streams of engagement for each Indigenous community that you are engaging with. And then I'll go on to capacity constraints and capacity funding. Some proponents, I think it's clear, are much further ahead on providing capacity funding. And proponents should be proactive on this front with Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities receive an extremely high number of consultation requests and have limited capacity in many cases. The onus is on the Crown or the proponent to adjust their consultation in consideration of this fact. It's advisable to provide Indigenous communities with longer timelines to review project materials and work with them to make timeline accommodations. I'll add that, due to this in Ontario, especially this current, probably nationwide, but particularly Ontario, to the housing shortage and the province's housing objectives, development is happening at a pace that we've never seen before. And due to this fact, Indigenous communities, which were already busy, have become inundated with consultation requests. 2-week review times are not sufficient. Given the fast pace of development will continue, it's really important to factor in longer review periods. Building in longer schedules or review times up front will allow for the creation of more realistic project schedules. And then follow up if you don't hear back, and not simply email or letters, give them a call. Don't rely on written correspondence. Determine capacity funding as early as possible and build this into your budgets. I can't underestimate or overstress that point. And be upfront and honest about financial limitations that you might have as a proponent. And then really, providing capacity funding can really help alleviate some of the bottlenecks and yield faster project decisions. And the next thing we're hearing, Indigenous communities are not homogeneous. This should really go without saying, but Indigenous communities are, of course, vastly different and frequently do not share the same views on projects. Don't assume you'll hear the same perspectives from each Indigenous community that you're engaging with. We also have, in some cases, proponents I'll call playing favorites or selectively engaging Indigenous communities that the proponent thinks will be supportive of their projects. That's not acceptable. Learn the engagement preferences of each Indigenous community that you're working with. Some will have consultation protocols or processes already in place, and those are obviously to your advantage to understand and utilize those. And as noted earlier, meet Indigenous communities separately. Be open to different modes of engagement, whether that be your typical meetings. It could be attendance at community events that they're holding, perhaps powwows, site visits, whatever works best. It'll be different for different Indigenous communities. And then be considerate and aware of really the different groups within an Indigenous community, such as council, staff, elders, on and off reserve members, traditional leaders. It's a community, so it's made up of different people, different folks. What else are we hearing? We're hearing that in some cases Indigenous views are actually being dismissed. Indigenous views on cultural heritage and archaeology are routinely ignored. There's a tendency to compartmentalize the Indigenous input that's received into, say, for instance, a specific section of a document like an EA document, and input's not well integrated throughout the documentation. So it's, we shouldn't be giving a specific section to address all Indigenous concerns. It should be integrated. And really, and again, this kind of goes without saying, an Indigenous community itself is the only one that's able to determine what their own Aboriginal and treaty rights are, and the only one's able to determine whether a proposal will actually impact those Aboriginal or treaty rights. So engage them on that. And the Crown and the proponent must be receptive to act on feedback and input during the consultation process. And then, of course, different world views. I think everyone has to acknowledge that everyone comes to the table with different perspectives and worldviews, and that needs to be considered and acknowledged. So I guess at this point, I would like to hand the presentation over to my colleague, Jeremiah.
Awesome, thank you, Sandy. So my name is Jeremiah Periak. I'm the Consultation and Engagement Lead for HDR. I'm also HDR's Equity and Engagement Lead for Transportation. In a past life, I have also worked for Mississaugas of Squaxin Island First Nation. So as Sandy mentioned, on the many projects that we've led Indigenous engagement on, there's been a lot that we've had to mitigate. There has not really been many projects that have not come without one problem here or another that we've had to sort of guide in the right direction. The process has never been perfect, and we are aware that there's always room for improvement, but there are a few commonalities between projects that we've seen become key difference makers for delivering good projects. I'm going to discuss 4 of those elements today. And again, these are strategies that we've implemented across a range of industries. This includes transit, residential developments, water projects, energy, and more. And again, this isn't intended to be all-encompassing by any means. This is mainly meant to share some strategies that have helped us to deliver better, more reliable, and more collaborative projects. So the first strategy we want to share is putting robust archaeology programs into place. Indigenous monitoring and representation during archaeology can truly be a positive step towards reconciliation. But as we've talked about before, cutting corners is something that happens a lot on the consulting side. This is one of the more common areas where we're seeing these corners being cut. We have a few points on the slide here that sort of speak to establishing a sound archaeology program. As everyone here knows, any great project really does start with a great team. So it's essential to make the right choices in terms of your project staff, which is why choosing the right archaeology team is our second bullet there on the slide. I know this might seem like a little bit harsh to say, but not every archaeology team is built equally. From working with Indigenous communities over the past few years, it's become abundantly clear that there are archaeology teams who have excellent relationships with Indigenous communities. It's those excellent teams that are able to build longer-term relationships with Indigenous communities, understand the nuances with working with them, and really help drive a project forward. Inversely to that, there are archaeology firms that are known for cutting corners. There are archaeology firms that are known for disrespecting Indigenous communities and generally not caring about Indigenous views or treaty rights. And this is why, and it ties into our third point on the slide, at the beginning of many projects that do require archaeology work, one of the first steps we take is meeting with the Indigenous communities who we know are going to be consulted on the project and ask them directly, which archaeology firm, which archaeology team would you like us to engage? Again, this isn't being done enough, and we end up in a lot of situations where there are archaeology teams that do more harm than good are being put onto projects, and this doesn't benefit anyone. It sets your project back, it creates a harmful environment with the Indigenous community, and there's many ways that you can proactively avoid this just by having that conversation with the Indigenous communities or the multiple communities that you're engaging prior to your project. By taking this proactive step early on, you can really help to mitigate these risks. The fourth point that we have on there is to engage during stage 1 and stage 2 archaeological assessments, especially in areas and on projects known to be of significant Indigenous interest or concern. Think of projects that are fairly controversial that are out there right now. MZOs, urban boundary expansions, real estate development projects in certain geographic areas, water projects that could impact local bodies of water. Those are all projects where early engagement can definitely benefit the outcome of your projects. You might not technically need statutorily to engage on stage 1 and stage 2 archaeological assessments for these projects, but it does set your project up in a better, does position your project better if you are taking that step. Next on there, we have empowering Indigenous communities to take an active role in archaeological sites and share traditional knowledge. We also want to be very clear about this, that working with Indigenous monitors on archaeology sites should be considered an honor. If there are opportunities for those monitors to directly participate in the fieldwork or share their knowledge about the site, that opportunity should not be wasted. Overall, like I mentioned, archaeology is one of those areas that we see consistently being overlooked on projects, but it doesn't need to be that way. Making the investment upfront in a robust archaeological program, whether that investment is a financial investment or an investment of time, can lead to better project results. Moving into our second lessons learned, I wanted everyone to sort of pause and think for a second about a space that is inclusive and friendly. I bet no one really thought of a construction site, I'm assuming, and that's okay. Construction sites have historically not been a safe space for many groups, and on a number of construction projects that we've worked on, we've also had Indigenous monitors on those sites, particularly through construction and environmental monitors. Across a number of those sites, there are some troubling trends that we noticed and some themes that were very concerning to us, especially on larger sites where we had 5 to 10 firms on a site at a given time. There were several issues that were brought up by those Indigenous monitors. Issues specifically affecting Indigenous communities on those sites included discriminatory comments, a lack of respect, a lack of understanding and sensitivity. This wasn't a culture that we were looking to perpetuate in any way, so we developed a bit of a solution to try to help mitigate that as much as possible. Across a number of our projects, we started implementing Indigenous understanding and sensitivity programs to inform and educate field crews and construction teams about the history of sites, why monitoring programs were necessary, and how they, as a construction team, could be able to create a more inclusive environment. I want to be very clear as well that this program was not meant to be a be-all and end-all solution. This was sort of implemented in a way to be able to work with our construction teams and our field crews to get them more comfortable as a bit of a baseline, but also encourage them to speak to the Indigenous monitors who are on site and be able to learn and grow with them while on site. What we found from these programs was a lot of these incidents were barely based on ignorance or a lack of understanding. And by putting these programs into place, we have found that sites have become more positive, more inclusive, and we've also been able to increase some of those incidents that I mentioned significantly. Field staff have also commented that they appreciate their newly learned lessons and context, and work has been able to continue without interruption, and project teams, in my mind at least, seem to be better prepared for the future. Due to the success of these programs as well, we do expect to implement many more of them down the line. The next lessons learned I want to share are related to roundtable meetings. For the purposes of this meeting today and this presentation, we wanted to define roundtable meetings as meetings that are comprised of representatives from project proponents as well as multiple Indigenous communities. We have found these meetings to be especially useful on projects with a lot of moving parts. For instance, a mega project where there are ongoing archaeological, environmental, construction considerations at any given time would be a perfect candidate for these types of roundtable meetings. These projects often require buy-in or consent at a very fast pace, and in order to keep projects moving on schedule, taking the proactive step of developing, managing, and facilitating these roundtable meetings can help to collect input on multiple topics at once. Now, two things I wanted to touch on earlier from our presentation. Sandy did mention that Indigenous communities are not homogenous, and that is definitely true. The idea of these meetings is not intended in any way to replace the need for a nation-to-nation consultation at all. Nothing replaces that. Our main takeaway here, though, has been that these roundtable meetings, which we've been able to facilitate on a number of projects on a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly format, are sometimes necessary to expedite input on urgent issues and can be extremely helpful for keeping projects moving forward with consent and buy-in. And on that note of consent and buy-in, the last lessons learned we wanted to share today is the concept of co-creation. Now, co-creation is a bit of a newer concept in the engagement world, and it's something that we've been trying to implement across a number of our projects. For the purposes of this presentation today, we're going to be defining co-creation as a collaborative initiative between proponents and Indigenous communities that enables the joint design and delivery of projects. In this model of decision-making, as a consultant, we are trying to explicitly create a space at the decision-making table for Indigenous communities to make decisions alongside project proponents. This process is inherently rooted in equity, empowerment, collaboration, and consent. We have a few examples of where we've used this type of model before on a number of projects. On projects with design components, we've opened up our design process to the Indigenous communities that we've been working with to ensure that their views are reflected in the final design. In addition to this, on projects where we've had the removal of contaminated soils or water from sites, we've also worked with Indigenous communities to give them direct consent over where those contaminated soils and waters are eventually transported to. The benefit of this is that through that process, we've been able to work with the Indigenous communities to make sure that there's no potential risks of impacts from those materials being transported somewhere close to where they are living. On a lot of construction management projects as well, we've worked with Indigenous communities to help proponents develop the scope, scheduling, and safety protocols for project sites, again, leading to sites that are truly catered for those who are going to be on those sites. Again, these processes, in my mind at least, are painless to implement, but they go such a long way towards long-term relationship building. And with that, I will hand it back to Sandy to chat about long-term relationship building.
Thanks, Jeremiah. So, yeah, we wanted to sort of, close or talk about the last section that we want to talk about. Really, it's about long-term relationship building. Long-term relationships, it doesn't start or stop at the IA stage, I think I mentioned that earlier during the intro, that it's not just about how do we fit in Indigenous engagement within the context of an EA or an impact assessment. It transcends the boundaries of impact assessment, environmental approval, permitting, or the project development stages. It shouldn't also be a surprise that the history or legacies from activities predating a project will play heavily in the success of the current engagement, given the concerns about the adequacy of previous processes, legacy of developments, and concerns regarding cumulative effects of years of development on communities and traditional practices. And it's really important to understand that prior history of engagement of a client and the various parties who've worked for them is a critical factor to the success of any engagement program. It requires obviously some research, homework, sometimes tough discussions with the client, and at minimum identify how and why an engagement process is different from before. The legacy of that prior engagement and the delivery and the project delivery by other parties, often completely on different types of projects, is also critical to understand. This may have been a positive legacy where a community has appreciated an approach and would like to follow the same precedent. However, the reality is the majority of the time, the legacy is often one where there's significant needs to be made up to demonstrate how the new engagement approach is different. In all cases, there really needs to be a well-informed, well-researched, aware and ready to acknowledge and address that legacy by in fact doing better. So engagement really to support an IA or EA permitting process as part of project development really sets the stage for a long-term relationship with Indigenous communities, whether this is a long-term relationship specific to a project or if it's a long-term relationship with a client that will continue to operate within a nation's area of interest. You know, as we've seen across the landscape of recent projects delivered in Canada, for many projects, there are specific relationships associated with project delivery, whether it be in the form of impact benefit agreements, construction operations, project equity and investment ownership. And really, in order to make a decision on what relationship the community is comfortable with for a project or with a proponent, often the history of engagement, approaches to address the outcome of the engagement and the way decisions have been made will be revisited and discussed with community members. While this may not reopen specific matters within the context of an EA, this can definitely reopen or raise matters back in the court of community opinion, if you will. When it comes to a relationship between IA and EA processes, and long-term relationships, it's really important to understand the intent is to pursue a long-term relationship by providing opportunities to an Indigenous community. It does not trump careful consideration of the impacts of the project on these communities and these traditional practices. These are really separate considerations. IAEA methodologies need to address the potential effects on Indigenous communities and incorporate consideration of traditional knowledge separately from acknowledging the intent for provision of any future benefits. It really is, can't rely on implying that the project will have future benefits to a community if you're not addressing the specifics of the actual project in the immediate time frame. And really, I guess just to summarize, it's really obviously about building those long-term relationships with Indigenous communities. It's a critical element for really the successful delivery of any project or other initiatives on behalf of the proponents that consultants like us work for, and the Indigenous communities that can be affected by interests on those projects or initiatives. I guess we want to leave you with one last thought, and that's really the need to follow through on commitments made during the engagement process to establish that positive record of relationship building. And this follow through may not always be in regards to formal commitments noted in the stated EA documentation, but they can be matters that arise in a regular permitting and project delivery approaches outside of a formal EA or IA process. So that's what we wanted to leave you with, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you both. And I think what we'll do is we're going to merge our
Okay, we're going to merge the Q&A session into the panel session, which is coming up now. So I'll get Gary to come up and join us at the table, and then we'll get everybody's. Yeah, it's good. I'll make room for you guys. So if you do have questions for Jeremiah and Sandy, by all means, we'll bring that into the panel session. So at this portion, and we don't have a script for this, I might ask a couple of softball or hardball questions to kind of kick it off. Actually, in PhD defenses, I sometimes say to the student, what is the question you don't want me to ask you? And I always tell my students, prepare for that one. So one question I want to lead off at, because the word meaningful came up in both the presentations this morning, whether it's meaningful engagement or consultation. And I know we don't like checklists or litmus tests or things like that, but I'd just like to ask the guys in the panel, they all are all guys, I noticed, what is meaningful engagement or consultation? How do you know it when you see it, and what's your sense of that when you go, aha, that was meaningful? And I'm going to start in the far end with Gary, because he doesn't want me to.
That's right. I'll get you back. Send your grad students to me. No one passed this time. Meaningful is actually, this is interesting. I see this question all the time. I always thought we immediately consulted with you. And I'm like, well, what was the terms and conditions set forth by the nation? Right? It's in a settler perspective. The Crown doesn't understand what meaningful consultation is, so therefore, what is the nation actually telling you meaningful is? Simply, okay, you guys hear me?
Yeah, we're just going to turn it on.
Oh, okay, well, that's not going to be there. There we go. So it is actually defined by the nation. And that's the funny piece, right? Like, everybody's striving to hit this target of meaningful, but it depends on the project. It doesn't depend on, like, what the Crown says, what this says, like, who says this. I actually read a report the other day where we were misquoted, and the Crown actually wrote, meaningful consultation was achieved. And I'm like, let me just check that. I don't think I would write something like that. And then, oh, meaningful consultation was not achieved. Oh, typo. And, and then it's an intervention too, so it's gonna be fun. And so we actually had to resend that, like, hey, by the way, you backspace that one all to death. But, and I said, and we actually usually write, by the way, meaningful consultation was never defined by the nation as a target. We thought if we had these meetings, like, ironically, a lot of the things people do where they believe they're meaningfully consulting is actually under the spectrum of engagement, is actually just information sharing. You came, you did a presentation, you leave. You came, did a presentation, you leave. Oh, we have a report to review. Okay, we took your comments, didn't really care for your comments, but we're not gonna do anything about those comments, and you leave. That's actually all information sharing. That is not technically or legally meaningful consultation, or even consultation. You're just engaging at that point. So you need to actually understand where you're in the spectrum of that framework. Gentlemen?
Jeremiah, can I put you on the spot?
Yeah, is this on? Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So yeah, exactly what Gary said. You want to be able to have that feedback directly from the communities that you're working with to say, yes, you reach that threshold of meaningful engagement, but there's two mistakes that we are still seeing being made quite a bit. One is that a lot of proponents are coming in with checklists, saying that if we meet this threshold, if we meet with communities 5 times, if we meet with them 7 times, there's no way that we didn't meet the threshold for meaningful engagement, so by default it's done. We have been encouraging proponents to sort of throw those types of standards out the window because they're not really applicable. Just because you meet with the community a number of times or you're providing the information doesn't mean that threshold for what we would call meaningful engagement has been reached. The other side of that is that there's a lot of bad consulting advice out there, and I know Gary touched on that earlier. There's a lot of consulting firms out there that will inform proponents that if you don't hear back from an Indigenous community in the 2 2-week period, that silence is consent. And we're seeing that more and more, and there's a lot of bad advice out there, but being able to weed out that bad advice and provide good advice to your clients and being able to at least push them in the right direction can be the make or break for these projects and has a longer term impact on both the project success for if you're doing an environmental assessment for that EA, let's say, but also longer term project viability to see the whole project through.
Is that a shameless plug for the services of HDR and their high quality?
Not,
Okay.
not exactly.
So one thing I was wondering, and I'm trying to avoid the idea of a checklist, but would you frame the lessons that you've put up there, which I think are grounded in experience, as best practices, or pointing us in the direction of creating best practices?
I would say they've been. I would say they've been effective for the projects we've worked on, but they're depending on where you're working with, which communities you're working with geographically, or if there's been a recent election, that process might change significantly. So we are very cognizant that what's on the screen here might be irrelevant depending on which communities you're working with, or it might be irrelevant depending on the outcomes of an election down the line, or if a proponent were to have a negative interaction with the community that would require more than what's seen up there on the screen.
Okay. Gary, can I put you on the spot about best practices?
God, me again. Do we have other Indigenous people here to answer some of this? Oh, I'm just kidding. Oh, there we go. Good. It is interesting with best practices. Like, I actually never take the same approach every time I do a project. So I usually say, did you have an idea for a project? That's probably when you should send us a notice, right? I always quote Chief Phyllis Williams when she said, if you didn't know if your project would impact our rights, it doesn't hurt to ask. So have that early on conversation to be like, hey, like, is this going to, cause a problem? And, typically we say yes, because of the impacts of previous projects, but it is actually just having that humility piece and saying, hey, let's come forward and here's some of the, what is the actual question? What is your end result? What is the history? I love the fact that you guys actually said the history of your project team. There's sometimes we are not going to come to the table because of your project team. We actually don't want to. And that goes into that settler fragility piece. For archaeology, we actually have a document that says you must include us at phase 1, right? Because of the bad archaeology done in Southern Ontario. So you need to understand that community dynamic and that relationship, but it is actually like, we just like to be notified. That way too, and I've talked about this to other people, I'm doing all these great projects with land trusts, and how we want to give land back from land trust to First Nations. Even those are conservation-based projects, they're good projects to the environment. You still need to follow our governance and our protocols. And they're like, well, we called you on Friday, can you not make the meeting on Monday? Well, nope. And can you usually, right? And so we do need long lead times because of the volume of work. So I'll give you a great example. My firm has almost been in business now for 3 years. Not a bad time. We've done over 600 projects defending the rights of nations in 3 years. Can you, as a small consultancy, or better yet, the Crown, process 600 projects in the efficiency that my firm is doing for those nations? I don't believe that, right? And you said, was it 18 letters a week? We get 39 to 112 letters a week, right? And so we actually have we actually had to create special, a server and an email just for that, because it was jamming everybody. And so understand that we do have this large volume of mass on projects which are just coming at us every day.
Thanks, Gary. I'm going to stop now and turn it over to you guys to ask questions for our panel. And I have a hand up in the middle.
Hi. So one thing that's occurred to me in working on files with Indigenous communities, and I'm a lawyer who tends to act for Indigenous communities, not a consultant, is that the proponents have often set the consultants up to fail because, they put out an RFP that doesn't have enough built into it for proper consultation. And, the consultants are competing for the bid. They're trying to put in a lower amount. And so they haven't put in the resources in the bid to be able to do the consultation properly. So what is the obligation on proponents to be spending staff time to build those relationships across multiple projects, and also to be building these kinds of approaches into their RFPs?
Can we hit that one first?
Yeah,
Sure. That's a great question. So there's many things we can do. So, and I'll talk about what my relationships team has done for nations in our territory. I'd actually would say like Durham region is fantastic at it right now. We have a relationship agreement, participation agreement for Curve Lake and Hiawatha with them. So that consultation piece is built in, right? We have now, there's some things I ain't gonna lie to you, like consultants shouldn't be doing. And we've teased that away from them. We do peer reviews of the documents. We help do study designs. We have that co-governance structure, so we actually have that in play. We have also now, in other counties like County of Peterborough, created RFP language, right? We actually, you need to have 3 territory references that you can actually do a good job on that project. Because that's the thing, right? Everybody says they work great with First Nations. And so, so then we actually reference check that, right? You know, it is, and it's funny because it's no different than, we've actually worked in that Western construct of like, hey, yes, can you give you 3 Williams Treaty references, right, of projects equaling of this dollar amount, or you know, we've actually worked in that system, but we do have these relationship frameworks, you know, like we are working on one right now with TRCA to actually be a part of and participate, and so our experts go out and we participate in the field. That's great, because that's where we should be moving to, because, yeah, like, I ain't gonna lie to you. You say, okay, I'm just give a rough example. We're working with a bridge engineer. He doesn't care that my people are fishing underneath that bridge in his construction window. He wants me out of there. He now doesn't care that I have a legal right to be underneath that bridge when construction is happening. We need to find that place, and we need to actually empower these proponents to have that knowledge too. And that's the other piece that's really hard. But yeah, we've been working on these relationship frameworks now for a couple of years. And we have quite a few signed with different people.
Sandy?
Sure. So I guess just from a consultant perspective to answer that question about, I mean, obviously we prefer to work with proponents who are proactively engaging outside of the framework of a specific project. But yeah, we do see RFPs come in with these minimum requirements to engage, and it is a competitive bid process, let's face it. I think how we attempt to address that is, if we're successful in winning the project, we will then say, like, okay, you know, we did what you said in terms of what you asked for, but it's not going to be sufficient if you want to have a successful project. So here's what we recommend. Or in some cases, depending on the structure of the RFP, there may be like an innovation component where you can actually say, here's what we think you should do in terms of an enhanced Indigenous engagement program, and we think it'll have all these benefits and it'll only cost this much money. So yeah, it is challenging for sure when you know it's insufficient and you're bidding on the work. We try to address it if we're successful.
Thanks very much. Back to you guys.
Hi, I was wondering if you have any general ideas about ways to lower the barrier of engagement for Indigenous communities and nations which may be more or less prepared to manage the engagement that is being put upon them, coming more from maybe a government or a consulting perspective. What could they be doing to lower that barrier beyond coming prepared to the table?
And you thought the questions would get easier. I'm going to start with Gary and then move in this direction.
So let me think. So are you asking, like, we have barriers in our communities to have us become prepared to the table to talk? Oh.
What are the barriers that the government?
Oh, okay, that's fantastic. I can totally answer that now. Yeah. I'm like, well, we're actually quite prepared. It's usually you guys that are. So I do this analysis thing that's super funny, and I got really lectured by an old retired lawyer who was actually a property lawyer who actually has never done Indigenous or environmental law the other day. So that was fantastic. And he's old, he'll die soon, it's fine. But I look at every project from this perspective, from the settler mindset. I used to work, well, my grandfather used to say the darkest days I ever had in my life was the days I worked for the Crown. So he was really disappointed in me then. But if you look at it from this lens, consultation comes down to three things: land, control, and fear. Right? Settlers are afraid of losing control. They're afraid of us for some reason. And it's all about the land. So like, if you have to start breaking those three barriers down, and once you start doing, every project I do, I look at it from that, like, what are we working in? Are they afraid, right? Like, I'm having lunch with a Crown proponent that will remain nameless, but they're all afraid of me. Why are they afraid of me? That's why, I said, like, I'm really shocked that they're afraid of me. Are they losing control? Oh, it's definitely about the land that they're going to take away from the nations or the public. So you need to start looking at it like that. It's really simple. It isn't that complicated if you look at it through those three doorways, and then you're able to build that relationship out. But that is the settler mindset is always about losing something instead of working together, and it's been like that about 587 years. So we need to start changing that mindset.
Thanks. Over to you guys. Did you follow up?
And top that. That's right.
That's great. Thank you. And we have another hand up. I'm going to issue a challenge. If you're on your phone, turn it over, put it on the table. Just be in the moment in the room with the rest of us.
Hi, I have a question about just wondering your comments and thoughts around scenario where there might be disagreement on which communities should be engaged. For example, when a proponent might receive a list from the Crown about potentially impacted communities, and then might receive different advice from some of the communities that they already have a relationship with, for example.
Start with Gary.
Yeah, totally. Let's start with me. This is what I totally got this one. Listen to the First Nations. Yeah. We actually know where we signed our treaties. The Crown doesn't. The Crown really doesn't. I love it. After I was on a MECP expert panel to review, duty consult, and an environmental assessment, and even the Crown, after our national apology, still argued with me about the nations that we had to. And I'm like, by the way, I got this map that you gave me. And they're like, what's this map? We've never seen that before. I'm like, well, you're MECP, aren't you related to Ontario Parks? It was on your website. And they're like, oh, crap, right? And they're like, my one role model is House, and the other one's Gordon Ramsay. And so I was like, really sarcastic about it, but I'm like, you guys should know this. And we also know what treaties we signed. I know all 18 of my treaties. Right? Can I recount them? We can now, because we have, so listen to the rights holders about where our territories are. I always find it funny that we get in arguments with people who actually don't know the difference between a rights holder, interest holder, and Indigenous stakeholder, right? Or an urban Indigenous person. So if they can't get that right, how do they know where the treaty boundary is? And the big secret is they're all watershed based, because we lived on watersheds. So that's why the straight line thing is really, we find offensive. Right, so it's really interesting that people aren't relying on the nations more than but they use it as a crutch. Well, the Crown says I have to consult with, so and that's that settler fragility, right?
I guess the only thing I'll add to that is if in doubt, err on the side of caution and engage more Indigenous communities than you think might be required, or the list that you get from the government, because there's really nothing.
I argue on that one. Oh. I have a rebuttal on that one.
Okay, well that's my apparently flawed suggestion, but.
Yeah, you take it first, yeah.
And Gary and I ran into this on a project about a year ago, I think, as well, where we were working on an environmental assessment, and we were given a list of Indigenous communities by the Crown to consult. And Gary pointed out that there was some disagreement on that list in particular. And from a consultant perspective, we don't really have the power to go to the Crown with that concern to say, we don't think, and we've heard from the Indigenous partners that we've engaged on this project, that your list might be wrong, or might have too many communities listed on it. As a consultant, we're not always in that position to make that call or to actually call the ministry and say that. We did have Gary on that project who did do that.
Yeah, so that's one of those things, right? It's funny, consultants, I'll lead with consultants first. Consultants are so quick to barrel through engagement, but then when we say, hey, by the way, you're doing it completely wrong, they don't have that inner humility to actually take it back and write that in the record of engagement to be like, oh my God, we screwed this up, right? Like, I can't wait to see my next intervention because we have like 9 letters of examples where the consultant was actually racist to us as First Nations. Like, that's going in front of the crowd that they're now going to have to address. And we're sorry, but just behave better. But when a nation comes to you and says, hey, by the way, you have a wrong list here, your job as a consultant is to communicate that to the proponent, to set a meeting up with the Crown and the nations to actually hash that out. That is your responsibility. The other issue that you have, if you over-consult with nations who don't have rights or territorial jurisdiction to those spaces, that you're now causing turmoil for those nations who do have rights, and you're causing an improper land claim by those nations, right? That is why you see other nations exuding rights they don't have on other First Nations territories. You inadvertently, as a Canadian, has aided in the colonial process of taking land away from other nations. And you've done that by the power of a letter. And you need to stop doing that. You need to establish the relationship with the nations. The Crown needs to do their homework too and actually understand treaty boundaries versus interests and actually work through that process. I would actually say on the far side, the settler side, this is actually a flawed system that needs to be QA'd really hard in the next, now, I guess would say, because, the maps are wrong. We have all the maps. Like, if you've seen the historical maps for Toronto and the Toronto Purchase, you'd be floored, right? And the parameters within those treaties, you need to actually have that research and go back and do that research before you actually issue a letter.
Is there any follow-up to that? It's quite important. It's a foundational need. What would a better system look like, or a better process for at that first stage look like?
Maybe I have a question for Gary as well, because speaking
The
about
panel
that.
can't ask questions out of the panel.
But
no rules.
But
There's some rules here.
Speaking specifically about a project that we worked on previously, I'm not sure if you recall that one, but in that situation, we did speak to the Crown and say that you have a wrong list, but they sort of told us to deal with it at that point. And as a consultant, we don't always have the recourse to be able to go back on that conversation, because we are so bound by legislation.
Right.
So sometimes we don't know what to do in that situation.
Yeah, and that's the problem, right? The Crown is actually very weak in that perspective. I did get a signature on a contract the other day from King Charles, which I thought was kind of fun. And his administrator said, we're so excited that Gary and Francis were able to sign this contract. I'm like, I bet you they kept him up all night, right? I'm like, oh, good God, Gary and Francis signed that the other day. Been waiting for that one. And we'd laughed about it, but it was like, we need to have that humility piece, and we need to say, hey, Crown, you don't know what you're doing. So this is what I did to MECP on the legislation. I said, okay, here's your list of 30 communities for Vaughan, which I was like, okay, neat. There's only 8, but that's okay. Prove to me, as the rights holders, why you are giving assertion to those communities. You actually get off your chair, go over to the archive, research out why you believe these nations have it. Here's my legal documents, because we have them, but prove to me why that community has a right over me. And then as soon as I did that, and I sent it through our lawyer, oh, so there's only 8 First Nations that have rights to Vaughan. And so it was funny because of that cowardness of the Crown to actually make a decision on your behalf. And they need to actually understand their boundaries, but also understand that the nations have legally kept this process going for 15,000 years, and we know who has rights to whatever. I look at the dish with one spoon wampum belt and how settlers bastardize that all the time, then now include themselves in the dish with one spoon, and that was never written for you guys to be a part of. It was written between us and the Haudenosaunee as Mississauga people to partake in that. So all of a sudden it's like, and the settlers get to partake in that dish with one spoon now. Like, no. And so those are those things, right? We need to actually really understand what was written and what was discussed to honor those things and understand that these trees are alive and we expect them to be treated with respect, that they're a living being. They're not just a document. It is a living spiritual thing. So that's the big piece. And so when we say, hey, by the way, you got this wrong, you need to come back as a good scientist or a researcher and say, well, this is what we thought. Instead of just saying, no, you're wrong, First Nation. Right? That's colonialism. That's a form of racism. It's a racism by low expectation. That's systemic racism by the Crown to us, right? There's a lot of racism that is involved when a Crown entity comes back and says, well, no, you're wrong, First Nation, right? We know where we've been. You put us there, right? So that's the reality of it.
Thank you. Back to the audience. And over here in the corner. Do you want to use this one?
Yeah, come on up here. Yeah.
You're almost there. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. No worries. Thank you to each one of you for the great presentation so far. Circling back to creating relationship frameworks. I guess this is more for Gary. I'm from GHD, so fellow consultants with HDR. When we're working with clients, we're seeing that there's no relationship framework established. Do you take it upon yourself to offer suggestions on how to create those frameworks? Or is it more the proponents themselves who should be establishing them? Like, do you ever, is the onus, I know the onus is completely upon the clients, but from your perspective, is there anything that you can offer to them?
Yeah, it's a two-way street. I'd actually say it is actually a two-way road on that one because, you know, sometimes like I look at, we'll use Durham Region for example. They have, I don't know, a bazillion EAs that we have to review. So we said, can we suggest this? This way you actually now, because like once again we talk about time and timelines, you now have the ability to schedule a meeting with us because now you're working with the nation. So we will meet every quarter instead of whenever we can. We'll actually schedule in the calendar for the nation to meet. We will have deliverable deadlines. Okay, so you actually need this permit done. Well, because we have a friendship and a relationship, we'll work to try to get that done. So it's a different piece. And that kind of materialized kind of organically. Sometimes, you know, I look at it and say, hey, we should create a relationship agreement because you are violating the Constitution of Canada. You're setting yourself up for a lawsuit. So it just depends on the road that you're going down. Sometimes some clients aren't there, right? It's just like, okay, we'll still do it case by case. You know, and when the really cool part about these relationship agreements, we meet every year, usually in the first quarter, and we have a feast together to celebrate the new year together. And then we're like, okay, here's all your known projects that you have. Okay, here's all the ones that we're interested in. The other ones, you don't need to consult with us at all. Please tell the Crown that we've signed off on that. Right? That way we're not bogged down and worried about, like, I don't really care that you're paving a road, right? God. I'm probably driving on that road, just so everybody knows. I would like it paved and level. But here's the parameters. If you start doing this on this project, you need to consult with us. But it's a very simple process. It's not as this drawn out process. So that allows that flexibility, right? Like we had a great example from Durham Region that said, well, we've already did the review, we did all this work on this project. Can we just roll that into the relationship framework, you know? I'm like, yeah, no problem. It was just very simple and seamless. And that's how it should be. And then they've actually spent the time, they've taken our anti-racism training. We actually, one of the things that we do with our anti-racism training is kind of fun but horrible if you're on the receiving end, is that we actually present letters that you have sent us as nations, and we actually go through and highlight all the different types of racism that you've actually communicated to us, and we actually kind of humiliate you, but that's what we do as Mississauga people. That's how you learn, just so you guys know. It's tough parenting, really tough parenting. I don't send you to a timeout, I just embarrass you in front of all your peers. And, but we say this is the racism, this is why we didn't come to the table. This is why we don't want to work with you. How can we change this culture internally? And that's what we've done, and so it's been working out a lot better. And I love the example of anti-racism on the construction site, because we have to do that. We have to go through that process.
Thanks very much. Did you guys want to follow up on that?
No, that was great.
Okay, that's great. And we'll go right to the front here.
Thank you. So I'm a consultant. However, the work that we do is working alongside and in collaboration with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis organizations and communities. And so We work with Indigenous organizations across the country, and we get to kind of see the gamut of certain proponents and crowns kind of interpreting duty to consult with the colonial lens and holding to the policies that they see set by the provincial or territorial governments. But we also see actors that are working to really respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Action 92 around calling on the corporate sector to adopt UNDRIP. And so in the Ontario context, Mark, my colleague here, and I, when we are working with communities that have a project that triggers a federal impact assessment in Ontario, we kind of go, yippee. There's a little bit more of a legislative and legal framework around consideration of impacts to treaty and Aboriginal rights and interests, as well as the consideration of just the partnership with Indigenous communities and co-collaboration when it comes to impact assessment. However, in the last 2 weeks, we've had a Supreme Court decision around the unconstitutionality of elements of the new Impact Assessment Act. And so I'm curious, with that in mind, and sort of what you're hearing from proponents and the communities that you work with, what kind of reaction has that garnered behind the scenes around the inclusion and going above and beyond the Crown's duty to consult in the Ontario context?
An easy one to
Well,
ease
actually, I
us
have a
into
really easy
lunch.
answer to that one.
Knock it out of the park.
So, yeah, so it's been kind of funny. For the last couple of years, we've been taking the Crown out of the equation because we realize they don't have the ability or motility to react and define what their actual role is under duty consultant. Once again, we talked about the errors they have and the wrong lists and all the errors that they've been prosecuting. So what we actually do now with the projects we work on is work with the proponent. We have the relationship framework set up. We actually actively engage with all the rights holders. We create a solution for that proponent to therefore take to the federal government as their solution. And this is, by the way, the nations are all backing up this idea. Off we go. And so a lot of the federal Crown agents I deal with, they actually like this approach because it makes their life a lot easier. They don't have to think very hard on the solution. And so it's like, yes, because it's like one of the things that started this whole process was it wasn't really the impact assessment, it was the DFO letter of advice, right? And I'm like, well, DFO can't identify their fish because I teach them how to do that as a fisheries biologist. How can they assess my rights on that river? Do they even know where we fish? Do we know where all these things are? So I said, they don't. So we need to actually, we actually sent DFO a letter and said, we don't honor your letter of advice to proponents, ever. That caused a bit of problems. And then we were able to work through that, and they acknowledged that they don't know. They don't know where we fish, we don't know where we harvest. They don't know where the important spawning beds are for our people. So then we said, okay, proponent X, you're gonna work with us, we're gonna create a relationship framework, because sometimes it's just one project, sometimes it's a magnitude of projects that they have multiple sites. And this is how we're gonna accommodate, and we're gonna work towards accommodation of our rights. And it's actually been working out quite well. It's been really a lot of fun because once again, we start building that relationship. We take them out on the land. One of the big things is like, how many times have you done projects you've never actually seen the site you were actually talking about, right? It's okay, you don't have to admit to me. I know just by all your body languages, you are writing stuff that you have never been to. So we actually take you out to see it, right? And we actually show you. We have like little boats. We take, we've really embraced the drones. We have an army of drones now, and we actually show you what you're doing, right? By the way, there's this over here, and those are things that you're missing in your Western assessments. So it's actually been quite good. It's almost like, I don't want to say we're circumventing the Crown, but we're developing industry relationships, which is now spilling into economic reconciliation, which is important. And that's what's happening, and it's creating that meaningful space.
Great. Follow up from our colleagues at the table here.
Well said.
Surprisingly good. So a couple of quick comments to close us off and move us to lunch, I think now. One more? Okay.
Oh, there we go.
What is the other one more? Oh, go for it.
Done right.
Yeah, thank you.
So thanks very much for the session here today. And we're done with session number 1. So thanks very much to the panel members up here and the moderator, Kevin.